Misinformation, it's everywhere, permeating our politics, our science, and even our spiritual systems. We really don't need more information. The internet offers more than one could ever possibly handle. We need something else. Because trying to find truth in the digital age is like trying to take a sip from a fire hose. There's way too much volume, often contradictory, often coming from a questionable source, and frankly, it's mostly disempowering that ends up leading to a dysregulated nervous system. So why are we even consuming this stuff in the first place? Yes, if we consume too much information that carries distortions, this can be very damaging to our mental health, and then by default, our physical health. Our worldview ends up collapsing into us versus them, or worse yet, a black-pilled negativity that cannot really perceive any positive change ever happening in the world. And this actually perpetuates suffering. All suffering can be traced back to the way that we think about things. So if our thoughts are positive, balanced, and objective, we will grow, we will expand, and we will find more joy, meaning, and prosperity in life. However, if our thoughts are compromised, then the rest of us will kind of collapse into a hopeless form of pessimism that ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. So even if anyone else does show up and tries to inject us with some good vibes, it just bounces off of us. It's like a suppression field. In fact, my mentor, at one point, he did this thing where he had what he called like a spirit radio. So he was able to actually like channel spirits through a radio. He said whenever a skeptic or someone who just like wasn't open to that would walk into the room, it would go from like a crystal clear signal into a bunch of distortion. So he says skeptics carry a suppression field around them that actually suppresses the magic from happening. So they're not only muggles, they're also like muggle expanders as well. That's not what I want to happen for any of us, though, because I know why you're here today. You're here to explore the greater mystery of life and the greater beyond. Fortunately, there is a way of validating incoming information and knowing how true it is. And this is really important because if you read a lot of spiritual stuff and you don't know how to discern truth, you can actually create psychosis for yourself. It's a very unpleasant state because your mind isn't able to reconcile all the differences in subjectiveness or distortions that occur in different pieces of information, and you end up living in your mind as opposed to actually embodying the experience of the teaching and using it in everyday life. This way that I'm going to show you here is actually part of the 7 liberal arts. It was the Trivium. And so this dates back not only to ancient Greece, but actually before that to ancient Egypt. So when we learn this in a modern context, it becomes bye-bye fake news because I want to hand you the keys to knowing truth, even in this age of fake news. In today's world, this skill is, trust me, more important than ever. Hello, I'm David Kahn, and you're watching The Mechanics of Reality on the Octave Leap channel. In today's episode, we're going to learn how to think so that you can know how to ascertain truth versus misinformation. And this is a really important first step in the series because I want to share with you how I came to my conclusions. That's right. In this episode, I'm spilling the beans on not only how I came up with what I did, but also the exact sources. And these are lesser known, like rare, potent sources that I came across. My experience was not all learned from books. I actually was in close quarters with not only 1, 2, but actually 3 people who claimed to be from the future. I also spent 15 years in one spiritual lineage. It was a white tantric lineage, and then another 5 years in a very interesting quantum Kabbalistic tradition. So I've had quite a background and I've seen a lot of things that will kind of come out in the series that might challenge one's reality. And then some of the information and the language that went with my experiences actually came from reading books. So the books sort of gave me a context or a language. And I feel like some of these books that I'll be sharing later in this episode may be very helpful for you. So in truth, the best thing that I can say from any of this was the fact that I got a good education in what's called epistemology, and that's knowing how to learn. So if you know how to learn, then it doesn't really matter what you're encountering. You're going to be able to filter through the distortions and actually ascertain meaning on your path to continue moving you forward, and more importantly, to continue moving you in a direction that becomes immune to propaganda. So you don't get kind of caught in a negative slipstream. Because that's kind of the biggest challenge of our age. There's so much positive potential for this new era or new earth that's coming into form. However, as that becomes more of a reality, the background noise is also getting louder, and the background noise contains a lot of distortions that are basically being forced out of the planet at this point in time. So it's possible for them to hook into people, and that's why this skill is really important, is so that we don't get caught up in the distortions and that we actually stay clear during these next few years and decades as sort of the planet adjusts to where it's got to go. Yeah, that's why I'm sharing my sources with you guys. I want you to treat this as a scientific study, basically, and be able to check my work. Also, if you find this information interesting, I want to be able to share with you some of the books that touched my life and I had many amazing experiences from. Because ultimately, this is about being objective and collaboratively contributing to a body of work that is much larger than me. The way that I see this is a new approach to science in the 21st century, where we're actually beginning to incorporate energetics into the matter. So normal science is Newtonian physics, and now we're looking at how can we take experiential quantum mechanics and blend that in with Newtonian physics. Is this possible? This is an experiment. So I'm giving you my notes as I go. When you look at my resources and where I came from with this, you'll see that I didn't just tape a bunch of old theories together, but I actually passed this through, so this wide variety of eclectic sources, they're passed through a series of validations and also weighted against my direct experience of things that were happening in my life. And so intuition is also very important in this too, knowing what to choose and what's going to remain and what's going to have meaning beyond what we can ascertain from the five senses. So this is what I've used to create a brand new synthesis for the Mechanics of Reality series. And that's really what I'm hoping to impart with you guys, is how to go through that process. It sounds like it's long and complicated, but it kind of happens on autopilot at this point. And as a result of that, I'm able to get in the room with very interesting people. I'm able to have probably more interesting experiences than I would otherwise, and frankly, enjoy life more, because I'm getting to explore some of the deepest interests that lie in my heart by being able to communicate better and by able to understand what my true motivations are. And lastly, what I want to say is this is about being objective and also rational and also intuitive. And I feel like in its original form, what I'm going to show you today, it didn't really talk about that, because in those days, they mostly valued rationality. And my personal belief is that because in those days, intuition was just so apparent, they didn't have to mention it. We've kind of lost that as we sort of detach from natural cycles. So when you hear me talk about it, I'm going to be injecting a lot more intuition into the mix. And it's also where we're heading as a species. This is the innate human capability that we've kind of lost touch with, but it's going to be essential for the future, especially as we move into a period of time where we don't know what's real and we don't know what's fake anymore because of the whole rise of AI. And as a result of that, the only thing that's going to be able to really help us, in addition to our ability to think properly, is our intuition. The approach that I'm showing you today is something called the Trivium. It's not trifecta. This is called the Trivium, and it dates back not only to ancient Greece, but to ancient Egypt. It's a three-part system that will help you receive the right self-knowledge, to think critically, and become a magnet for truth. And like I was saying earlier, the Trivium is actually part of the 7 liberal arts. So this originated in the mystery schools of Kemet before finding its way into Greek philosophy. And this system has really stood the test of time as it was embedded into the early university systems. It's not taught so much today because it allows people to question things. And in my opinion, being able to critically think and question things should be the backbone of any modern education system. So let's dive in. But first, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and bookmark this playlist, because this video is really part of a much larger and much more important series called The Mechanics of Reality. Part 1 of the Trivium: input data. Traditionally called grammar, this is the first step in knowing truth: your input data, your knowledge. Think of the immense amount of information out there from all the various sources: mass media, politicians, entertainers, academia, religious institutes, NGOs, Greta Thunberg, Donald Trump, Pepe the Frog. Do they all paint a consistent version of reality? Hell no. These are very different, varied sources. We're not going to get a consensus, and chances are we end up kind of having to pick a side. That's just the way the mind works. It wants certainty. So we choose our camp, and we stick with our camp, and we tend to basically align with whatever information supports that choice. And this becomes a problem, because whenever studying anything, especially the material for this series, I really want you guys to know that I had to scrutinize a lot of opposing viewpoints in order to come to this. I had to take on and wear many different hats, and a lot of these sources never really aligned with each other. So looking at different spiritual systems, comparing it with science, philosophy, my own lived experience, not everything lined up. And oftentimes, I would get pretty confused because I think I knew how things worked, and then all of a sudden that model would fall apart. What I had to do here was create something and take an approach I call open-minded skepticism. And this is very key to how to intake any information, because open-minded skepticism means that I'm open to look at or explore any subject with curiosity, and skeptical because I know every information source is subject to propaganda or well-intentioned errors. The propaganda is really where the truth gets distorted, and it begins to influence information at the input stage. And so this is important to remember, is that no matter what we're taking in at this stage, this initial stage, it's probably laced with either some degree of propaganda or some degree of well-intentioned off-the-markness, because there's a human error, human ego in the mix. And really what we want to start to learn how to do is to access higher quality information that has fewer of these distortions, because you don't want to spend too much time processing a bunch of contaminated or distorted information. So it's best to sort it before you form a conclusion around it. So before you actually take it in and accept that as information. So when I approach any subject, I look at what I hypothesize something should be. So this is like a question. This is the basis of the scientific method. And what if we are energetic beings with more than the five senses? That would be a hypothesis, right? This is a question. And then I also have to consider its opposite. What if we do not exist beyond its five senses? This is where a lot of people, I'd say probably 90% of people, they don't do this step. And as a result, they never really question the initial hypothesis, which is really something we should be detached from in the first place. By doing this and not detaching oneself, one inherently holds a bias. In this case, material rationalists would be quick to condemn and refute anyone who claimed anything beyond what is physically observable. And then the more starseedy types, the more new agey types, would be inclined to dismiss the physical and material realm potentially and approach things from a purely energetic or frequency perspective. Now, is anyone inherently right or wrong with this? Well, I can't assume that from the beginning. Instead, I have to look at arguments on both sides of the coin and do it objectively without an emotional bias. So being able to suspend an emotional bias during our investigation process is extremely important. And like I said before, 90% of people they can't do this. They are seeking a bias confirmation. But by its definition, this is a problem, because this is the way the ego stays enmeshed within us. And ultimately what we want to do is we want to mature, we want to develop and gradually transcend the ego. And so it's necessary in that process to be fluid in our worldview, be fluid in our thoughts. But bias confirmation is essentially what keeps growth mindset away. So instead of looking at things with our, conclusion already determined and grasping it with a tight fist, we want to basically keep an open fist, or open hand, I should say, and look at everything with this open-minded skepticism to see, does it support your worldview? So be playful about it. And that's hard to do because people take life seriously, which is why you need to laugh, which is why you need to crack some jokes and stop taking life so seriously, so that you can actually hold your hand open and experience things with objectivity. When I start to explore the basis of things behind both sides of the coin, then I have to ask the question, where do they stem from? And intuition can be really great to help you on this, with the condition that you aren't taking things emotionally. So you can feel into, because sometimes you don't know, right? Like our financial system, it's like there's so many shell companies hiding. It's like, unless you're a sleuth, you're not going to find out who's behind it, but you can use your intuition. And without any emotional bias, you can get a read on whether this is something you want to align your energy with or not. Simple as that. I'll give you an example, though, of when intuition can not work. Recently, in the US, they had a presidential election, and there was a lot of psychics that were essentially predicting the outcome of the US election. But the psychics didn't check their own inherent bias. Their bias was influencing whatever they were data streaming or channeling, and so it was then filtered, distorted through this pre-existing lens. And so a lot of psychics were basically saying that, the other party would win with an overwhelming support. And then that didn't happen. And then they were very confused afterwards. And the reason why this thing that they felt so strongly intuitive about didn't play out was because there was a bias and they weren't able to see things clearly. So we have to understand that if we want to use intuition, we have to make sure that there's no emotional attachment to the answer. In fact, some of the best psychic intuitives, they come out of Russia. And that's because the Russian culture generally has less emotions that get in the way of things. A lot of people in that society make for better psychic intuitives because they can basically put their cognition and their intuition into one category and their emotions into another. So this is a skill that, other cultures can develop as well. And some cultures have this ingrained in the coming of age process and end up developing this in children, and some other cultures not so much. So neutrality and objectivity is key here, but this means running basically 180 degrees at odds with the rest of our society. So modern media is here to tell us what to think and how to feel about certain circumstances. Politics is definitely here to distract us. The entertainment industry is meant to basically seed our minds with dystopian future outcomes so that we, become more hopeless. This is obvious, right? I mean, how many positive movies do you see about the future on Netflix? None. So what we can do with this is understand that we're in a field or a realm where there's many different sources trying to get attention from us. And as a result of that, we really need to guard our mind space. So the best thing one can do is observe and soften whenever we feel particularly attached or triggered by a situation, especially if it's raw information. So the more that we're triggered by information, the more that we have basically likely been influenced by propaganda. Hate to say it, nobody loves hearing it, but there's a very powerful mantra that can break you free of the spell, even at subtle levels. Even if you think you're already awake, like I always think I'm already awake, then I find out there's another level of this thing. And so there's a very powerful thing we can say, and we're going to learn about it in this second section. Trivium, part 2, processing. Logic, understanding, processing. All the greatest knowledge in the world means nothing if you can't hold it, because you don't have an internal infrastructure to actually house it, which is essentially a worldview. Therefore, what have you done to make space for your incoming information inside your actual vessel so that you retain it? We can't just consume content all the time. It just basically washes over us and goes nowhere. We have to actually retain something, right? Otherwise, somebody says, well, what did you watch for the last 6 months? They're like, I don't know. Just life kind of drifted by. We don't want that to happen. So in order to do this, we need to suspend closed-mindedness and make way for a form of intellectual expansion, which in turn creates more room emotionally and physically as well. Because as you'll learn in this series, mindset determines your emotional state, and your emotional state determines how you feel. In other words, the way that you handle information and the way that you think actually, through a chain reaction, determines how you're going to feel on a day-to-day basis. Change your thinking, you will change the way that you feel. So do you watch the news and immediately feel tense and afraid? Or can you separate the apparent truth presented on the news from actual truth within your own system and receive it without it changing the way that you feel inside or the way that it actually impacts you? Because believe it or not, some people just don't get affected by propaganda. It just sort of bounces off of them. And that's because their worldview is strong. Their way of rational processing is very strong. So they hear things and they're able to very clearly and objectively not have an emotional attachment and say, this is true, this is false, this is partially true, this is partially false. Whatever it is, they can look at it objectively. This is very important. On a personal note, I've sidestepped the apocalypse probably 168 times by keeping a positive mind frame. That means not listening to the doomsday media, not listen to the prophets that have these doomsday messages. Tune that out and keep focused on your path. This is such an important timeline navigational tool because I've heard the doomsday bells ringing over and over, and I've got to say, sorry, death, not today. I have better things to do than be enraptured by fear and go down in this sinking ship. There's a quote by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, which once said, it is us that is personally responsible for making sure that the world does not collapse. It's a lot of weight to bear, but what this basically means is that when we keep a positive attitude, we then align ourselves with a future probability that is positive, and we then are able to skirt even what looks to be the most insurmountable obstacles in the world. Because at the end of the day, no matter what the propaganda tells you, you co-create your reality. And this is the biggest lesson that anybody could ever realize, is that actually we're powerful creator beings. And when we can get back to that point of basically think, create, then we know we've cleared our distortions. And despite New Age axioms You do actually have influence over your reality. And also, there is a natural law or overarching intelligence that you're kind of paired with. So your actions do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in a symbiosis with the rest of creation. So your mindset, and more importantly, your pre-existing worldview that basically all new information gets weighed against, does control a lot of what happens to you. Because let's face it, the future is a probability and not a certainty. And there are many probabilities, and no one knows which ones exactly will come to pass. However, the one that will come to pass is the one that has the largest collective thought form, meaning the largest amount of people thinking about it and pouring their attention into it. However, you influence that thought form. And if you know this, you can influence it much more impactfully than a million people approaching it with a very dullified, mediocre worldview. So the information you take in as a result of this is important, and it must positively contribute to shaping your predominant attitude or worldview. So the processing stage implies that you have an operating system or a strong why, right? And this is really going to help you filter through. Do you remove the distortions in the information that you're getting or not? Or is it contaminating you further? It's great to have confidence regarding your central thesis and being able to sit in yourself and know your own truth at all times whenever you're weighing it against the world around you. However, life will naturally pull the rug out from under your feet. And so there is an absolute truth we have to keep in mind here, and that's the law of impermanence. Everything is perpetually in a state of flux. Therefore, your worldview or attitude should remain adaptive towards new information and firm with respect to your values. In short, know what you stand for and allow it to be shaped by the forces of evolution, not the forces of involution. And both of these will be covered later in this series. So the mantra to help you adapt and process and experience more ease in life because you're not getting the hard lessons and you're getting a lot of synchronicities instead is this one. It's 3 words long and it goes, I was wrong. These 3 words are humbling and likely to be the most powerful 3 words that any of us will ever invoke in our lives. I've been wrong so many times on this journey, and that's what's actually allowed me to speak to this stuff. I built so many damn models of how reality works along the way, only to have them painfully dismantled and usually go with a major life lesson. So therefore, realize that no matter what model you create to process information, it is finite. Reality is infinite. Therefore, the law of impermanence always applies, and it asks us to surrender, to flow with life's currents and cast away our hubris so that we can cross the rivers of time and actually tap into universal consciousness to influence future probabilities positively. Section 3 of the Trivium, Rhetoric. Wisdom, output your dharma. This is the stuff you share, and hopefully not too preachy, because most people don't like that. But share it with love. This is your truth, so speak it loudly and proudly, and this is the way that you're going to attract your soul family. This stage is the finishing stage, the net result for the positive influences you've allowed to pass in and to be weighed against your internal processing. And so this is the transmutation of information into dharma. So it's important to remember that you can embody information, or you can say that you embody information. But the more that it becomes embodied, the more that it becomes your own. So there's a difference between parroting somebody else's wise words in a verbatim-like fashion and actually expressing that wisdom from a very embodied experiential perspective. So the output is really your litmus test for how on point you are in your journey with truth. If you're met with acceptance and harmony, then your worldview is actually fluid and positive. If you're met with resistance and aggression or no attention at all, then perhaps it's an opportunity to go back to the drawing board and really see, are you taking in the right information and are you in a fluid enough worldview that actually aligns with the impermanent nature of reality. Anyways, those are the 3 parts of the Trivium, and I hope you enjoyed this unique perspective on how to think. But if you ever want to forge a powerful worldview, you will want to learn this skill. It's one that served me greatly and actually allowed me to make a lot of the quantum leaps that I have in my life. So I normally relegate this stuff to those that want to pursue philosophy degrees, but it's actually a crucial skill for everyone to learn. And like I said, in the ancient world, this was taught part and parcel with a university-like experience in ancient Kemet and ancient Greece. And frankly, the 21st century needs this too, because in the digital age where AI can basically write convincing news articles, you need to be well-versed into how to intake, assimilate, and refine your truth so it doesn't become subversed into a narrative that you may not have initially signed up for. And also, I want you to be able to apply the same degree of scrutiny to my work as your practice. I want you to verify for yourself the things that I share in this series and that you have sufficiently explored it and integrated it. Because ultimately, what I'm looking to do here is create the dialogue on a new model of science, the mechanics of reality, how things work at a multidimensional level. How can we combine the things that we can measure in the Newtonian model of physics with the ultra small scale where things behave very differently at the quantum level. So this is basically a form of science that moves beyond the material and into the energetic and the experiential so that we may know and influence causality directly. So to know truth for ourselves because we've actually experienced it. So anyway, I have a little gift for you in this series, and that's the top books that influenced my journey. In my journey, I actually spent time with two teachers, one of a white tantra lineage, one of a quantum Kabbalistic astral projection for the US government lineage. And that spanned about 20 years of my life. And during that time, I saw a lot of very interesting phenomena that would probably be outside of most people's worldview. I've also had many experiences that went along with that. In that time, I also met three people who claimed to be from the future that told me about how things really work and what the future of humanity is. Now, I had to verify this information because I can't just believe people at face value. But the parts that I have verified are going to be integrated into this series for you. So I want you to know that a lot of the amazing things that I've experienced in my life have also been things that were meant to happen so that I can actually create this body of work now in 2025 for you. So yes, there will be stories along the way, and some of these stories might challenge your version of reality. So if you want to get started experientially with this and you're very interested, you can join the free 3-day Reveal and Heal Your Core Wound. This is a free journey where you get a free reading on your core wound placement and also how to shift it so that the distortions of the world around you no longer have the same magnitude and same impact, and you're able to kind of take that weight off that you feel from the collective. And if you're keen to start immersing yourself in this right now and you know, hey Dave, I actually want to get going faster, well, you want to check out the Pay What You Can workshop on multidimensional health. So I've partnered with Jade Sundari, who's doing a lot of Kundalini DNA activations, and I'm also covering the mechanics of reality in the context of personal health. So there's a link to that in the description below. And some of these practices will really help you create a very positive, life-affirming worldview. And so at the end of the day, I just want to let you know I'm here for you. And that's why I'm creating this series. I'm creating it to guide you in a way that will allow you to explore and open your mind and keep positive for this amazing momentum that we have in 2025 and beyond, and act as a modern mystery school that's available on YouTube on the Octave Leap channel. So make sure you're subscribed, make sure you got this playlist saved, and you've liked this video, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.